All right, so the next thing I want to mention is about interlinings. Now, let me show you. This is probably easier to show you than to try to, let's take her chasuble. All right. Some priests, when we do this, and by the way, we need to, before we do any lining, we need to sew your appliques down. And as far as your appliques are concerned, pick a color that is like you would use red, or you could use the gold. If you use the gold, you could sew right on top of that gold border, or you can take red and sew right inside the edge. You just want to go all the way around the outside. If you have an applique that you don't know the color is kind of a mixture of different colors, and you're afraid that the color will show, there's a nylon thread over there. It's called, what they call invisible thread. You can buy it in Joann's and other places. And you sew with it, because it's a clear thread, it takes whatever the color is underneath it, so you can use it for sewing down some appliques that maybe you don't have a color to match it, or the colors change, and if you use the same color, it would, let's say this was only the inside of this, and you have different colors like greens and whites, and you don't want, so you might want to use an invisible thread to go around that to sew it down. In your case, it's either gold or red, and you'll be fine. But you want to sew this down because you can't sew it down after we put the lining on it. So you need to sew it down first. All right, now, the way we're going to put lining down is the way the old vestments were made. And some vestments had an interlining. And I say some, not all. I do not put an interlining in a chasuble unless it's absolutely necessary. And because it adds weight to it, and it makes it hotter, and it's a waste of fabric. Because there's only one reason to add an interlining to a chasuble, and that is to support the embroidery that's on it. And if this is all the embroidery that's on it, doesn't need any extra support. But if this were all embroidered with gold thread, like almost three-dimensional, like some of the really old vestments that had all this gold work all over this, that's a lot of weight. Just the embroidery is a lot of weight. And if you're putting it on just one piece of fabric like this with a thin piece of lining, it's going to distort, it's going to hang, it's going to pull it down. And so in those cases, and in only those cases, if you really examine the old vestments, they put in an interlining. Now, the way they did it was, they didn't, again, fabric was an expensive commodity. It was usually done on silk, and when you think of silk, you think of only, really thick. Silk comes in many weights and in many types. There's the silk dupioni, yes, but there is also silk tweed, and there is silk velvet. There's silk. Silk is the fiber. What you do with it makes the fabric. I mean, so there's 100 different types of silk, and it comes in every type. Is anything that you can find in a normal fabric, whether it's like tweed for a suit, you can find a silk tweed. If velvet, you'll find a silk velvet. The way that it's woven, and those are the weaves. There's a silk satin. There's a silk taffeta. There's a silk moire. So any kind of weave, you can find it in silk or something else. So most of the fabrics used for vestments were silk, because they wanted to give the best to the church, and silk was an expensive fabric, and so they used silk. Now we have imitation fabrics that look as good as silk, and wear, if I may even say so, better than silk. So we can use those now. The church permits the use of them, so you can use them now. So fabric to us, it's $10 a yard or $15 a yard, where silk would be $30, $40, $70, $90 a yard. So when they used silk, they used as little as possible. And that's why over time you had the change in the Gothic vestments. Gothic vestments used to be what we call conical. It was one big round piece of fabric with a hole in the middle, like the tablecloth one, a hole in the middle for his head, and all the fabric was pulled up on the arms. And why do you think priests stand like this? You know, in the mass, they were holding. It was done because they were holding all that fabric up on their arms. If they put their hands down, of course, now it's down on the floor. We got to pull it all up again. And over time, to save that fabric, they began cutting away that excess fabric that's on the side that they didn't need. And you had the modern Gothic vestment. Modern Gothic vestment has been around for a couple of centuries. That's how modern is. But from the 12th century to the 17th century, you know, there's a long period of time in there where it changed over time. And we still have today conical vestments. They're still made, they still exist. So any style of vestment that ever existed can still be used. And you still have priests who like, for the sake of tradition, having some of the really old style vestments. But they needed to save fabric because fabric was expensive and poor parish couldn't afford it, so they began modifying the vestments. And the same thing happened when they were making this type of vestment. What they would do is, if they have an elaborate embroidery on here, they would cut away the fabric here, and here, and here, and here. And they would leave this piece of fabric, and this piece of fabric, and this piece, and this piece. And they would replace this piece with the section that is embroidered. So if you had the trim away, you would see this piece with abutting this piece of fabric, and there is nothing here. And that's why the trim is on here. That was why the trim would be here. It's just like you're using it to cover up the raw edge of this. They were using it to cover up the raw edge of this and this. So they would have the trim covering both. But in order to stabilize it, to make it even more, because again, you've got these pieces hooked together only with a piece of trim. They would put a piece of fabric exactly the same size underneath this, and they would under here baste this piece of fabric to the under fabric. And they would base this to the under fabric. And they would base this and this and this and this and so on, all to this under fabric. Then they would cover it with the trim and sew them down to all the layers. Then they would put the lining on. And the lining, of course, with the lining, you didn't see that this was actually 5 pieces of fabric all sewn together to an under fabric. And that was the purpose of the underlayment, was to stabilize all of these pieces of fabric and make it all one piece that could be treated as one piece when they lined it. We don't need to do that anymore. We're putting ours right down on top of it, which makes ours even more stable. And if this were a heavily embroidered piece that might pull on it, then yes, you would use an underlayment. Okay, so what underlayment did they use? Some priests will tell you, if you ever do a job for them, they say, well, it has to be really heavy. I want it really stiff. The vestment didn't need to be stiff. This is not a sandwich board. It doesn't have to be stiff. The weight of it was not the interlining. The weight of it was the embroidery. The interlining was, if you take them apart, a piece of linen. It was old linen. It was not, the kind of fair linen used on an altar. It was coarse-grained linen. And so you can, if you want to use an interlining, first of all, don't ever use Pell-on interlining. Don't. It's a paper product. And over time, as you get this vestment occasionally, and I do mean occasionally, dry cleaned, don't throw it in the washing machine. The fabrics that are used in here, this fabric could be washed. These fabrics probably could be washed. The metallic fabrics can't be washed. They will bleed. That metal, the metal covering, the covering that's on that aluminum, that gold covering will bleed. I found that out, unfortunately, by trying to wash a piece of old vestment. But anyway, it does bleed. So, and your trims will, if they have anything metallic in them, they will bleed as well. So your fabric may have been washable, but once you start putting your trims and your appliques and things on it, you've now made it dry clean only. But vestments don't have to be cleaned very often. Vestments can go for years without a cleaning, especially if you put a piece of linen or lace covering, and I'll show you about that, around the neck, because that's the only place that really gets dirty on a vestment, is the place up against the priest's collar. Yeah, he's a man, and you know, if they got sons, how often do they wash their necks or their clothes? They're not that clean on their clothes, even though they wear an amice that covers it. You know, those chasubles, they got a lot, it's black and you don't really see the dirt in it, and it's pretty dirty a lot of times. Because, you know, they come in for mowing the grass and it's time to say mass, so, you know, whatever. So that's the part that gets dirty on the chasuble, will be around the neck, usually just around the neck. So if you can have a piece of linen, you know, that you can bend over, it just runs from here around the neck to here on the other side, and this can be taken, and it's just tacked in place, that you can take that off every month or 2 months, or whenever you see that it's getting, you know, needs to be washed. You can either sometimes throw it away or replace it with, in the convent we replace it with another piece of linen. We have a drawer full of them, and you just take them off, put a new one on, and you don't wash the vestment, you just wash that linen, iron it, and get it ready for the next time. You can use a piece of lace. Lace tends to go around it easier because there's more bend in lace, there's more open pockets in lace. But anything, and I'll show you some alternatives you can use around the neck when we finish. So as far as cleaning's concerned, that's what, just it'll become dry clean only. Now, so getting back to the interlining, they just use rough linen. So you can, today linen is expensive, even rough linen is expensive. So unless you got at your disposal old altar closet, have holes on them that father doesn't need and wants to get rid of, you probably won't be able to use linen. So alternatively, you can use a linen-like fabric that you can find in Joann's. It's a synthetic linen. It has the same weight as linen. Also, you can use muslin. The muslin comes in different weights as well. You only need, but it is a sturdy fabric. Muslin is a very sturdy fabric. And that's what you need, something sturdy. It doesn't have to be thick, it doesn't have to be heavy, it just has to be sturdy. So muslin works fine.
Does it matter which muslin? Which weight muslin?
No, I wouldn't get a really thin weight, at least as the thickness, you know, this is a medium weight, and that's what you want is a medium weight muslin, not something really light, like slip material or something.
Mm-hmm. Excuse me.
Yes.
I just want to mention, Kathleen, there's pins in the where you're.
Yeah, watch out.
So just in case you stick. I just noticed that, and I didn't want you to stick yourself. Sorry about that.
No.
Okay, and if you have a priest who absolutely positively insists on being as stiff as a board, ask him if he wants plywood. But if he doesn't really understand the joke in that, then I know people who use canvas or duck. I do not recommend the use of canvas or duck, but there are some priests who think that in order to be a really good vestment, it has to be heavy. And they don't understand that the heaviness is the embroidery. The heaviness isn't the interlining. So if you have one of those, yes, cotton, duck, or canvas will work. But yeah, be prepared with the needles because it's going to be heavy. So, and the chasuble you're making today, we are not putting interlining in. So if you were putting interlining in, how would you do it? I don't suggest that you cut away the pieces like they did. I suggest that if this was your embroidery piece and because you had this heavily embroidered, you do this exactly the way we've done it. And you might want to, before you put the trim down, when you've laid this out, you stitched it down, you might want to then put your interlining under it. Your interlining will be cut exactly, no seam allowance, exactly the same size as this. You can just put this down on top of your interlining and cut around the outside of it using this as your pattern. Once you've done that, you pin it together and you can sew across the ends of these sections that you put in before you put your trim down. And to make this and your interlining one piece. And then you're going to cover it with your trim. You know, you'll have some pins around the edge, to keep this, because now you have a sandwich. You have this and the interlining. And when you add the lining, then you really have a sandwich, because now you'll have 3 layers. But if you're doing that, you don't have to baste stitch this underneath your trim. You can just put this all together, even with your heavy embroidery, and then put this on top of the interlining, cut it out, and then put both of them on top of your lining and cut it out. And the lining will hold the interlining in place, because they'll all be stitched together around the edge. And your lining, your interlining is adding a little extra weight to it, and it is adding some support. But if you have a heavy embroidery, you probably should do the basting stitches in here before you put the trim on under it. I wanted to show you this because there's always a question about interlining. This is an interlining. An interlining is this fabric that goes between the main fabric and the lining. This with the lining. This interlining. When do you use it? When don't you use it? I almost never use it, but on this vestment that I'm making, this is a silk velvet, and it's very light and flimsy. And on this, I have this gold, the Celtic cross made out of gold, metallic gold cord, and it's very heavy. This vestment is heavy. This is all metal, and it's and this silk would not be able to support the weight of that metal. So in this case, I put an interlining. Again, this is a case where I couldn't use stitch witchery. What I did was I laid it out the way I wanted it, and in each of these joints, I put fabric glue. I put the fabric glue on a plate. I don't just add it with the fabric glue. I put the fabric glue on a plate, used a straw, picked up some of the glue, slipped it under, pushed down on the trim to hold it, pulled the straw out, and left the little glob of glue under there where it would stick. And then later I went through and basted. You maybe can't see it, but I hand basted first. There's a lot of hand basting stitches. And then I sewed it down with the machine. With the machine I used a walking foot because of the thickness of this metal, and I didn't want to get it caught in the foot, which it would do anyway, but not as much as without a walking foot. So again, this type of vestment. This is a shoulder. This meets at the shoulder type, and again, it's thin. So I used the interlining. We get this out of the way, and then I'll show you what we're doing today.